I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, we're looking at politicians' claims and how sometimes they overclaim for achievements that they didn't exactly bring about. With me will be US legal scholar Peter Shane.
I'm not going to answer the question because the question is radical left. Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well,
I'm speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
Well, we're not afraid of weird people. We're a little bit creeped out, but we're not afraid.
We did it. We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
We're planning for winter in the NHS earlier than we've ever done before. That's why today I'm announcing £250 million to invest in more A&E capacity in 30 different sites across the country.
The ambition for 1.5 million homes is an ambition because it's the nation's ambition. People recognise we're in a crisis and we have to do something about it.
Oh, I want to talk about IVF. I'm the father of IVF.
Here they go again. Politicians making big claims. Fast talking, perhaps so fast that you don't quite know whether it's true or not. Like magicians pulling rabbits out of their hats, politicians are always promising to make things happen. Speaking in the past tense, they tell us about the magnificent achievements that they brought about. Speaking in the future tense, they point to the wonderful accomplishments that they will surely achieve if only we afford them the blessing of our trust. Rather like an entertainer with a wand at a children's birthday party, politicians invite us to gasp with astonishment at feats that we can only really admire through the suspension of disbelief. For in reality, elected politicians are only one small part of a complex machinery of governance and policy implementation. Most of what happens in the day-to-day administration of nations, cities and transnational institutions lies beneath their reach and understanding. I want to look today at how politicians make claims. And in the spirit of the Sound of Politics, I don't want to argue that these claims are true while those claims are false. I want to think about what it involves rhetorically to take responsibility for an action that you can't possibly have accomplished on your own. Politicians are notorious overclaimers. That's how elections are won. They need to capture our imaginations, gain our trust, take us on a journey into a plausible future. But at the same time, politicians need to be careful not to overclaim beyond the limits of plausibility. Trump was not the father of IVF. Al Gore didn't invent the internet. Adolf Hitler was never going to rule for 1,000 years, however loud he shouted. If politicians insult our intelligence by making claims and promises that we know are clearly beyond them, they will merely be dismissed. In fact, most of the hard work of policy construction, refinement and implementation is conducted by faceless civil servants, expert advisors, anonymous administrators whose expertise politicians draw upon if they're wise, but rarely credit. If they're talking about housing, few politicians really know anything about architecture, town planning, the legal regulation of buildings. If they're talking about smoking, few of them know much about epidemiology, the statistics of mortality, or the prognosis of different forms of cancer. So we find ourselves in a rather distorted political world in which the people who know most about policies rarely speak directly to the public. And the people who take public credit for policy speak from scripts written by those voiceless experts. What the most competent politicians are good at, in fact, is taking the best advice that is available and pulling various strands of thinking together into a coherent programme of action. They're summarisers, simplifiers, people who are good at précieing wise knowledge. But we very rarely hear politicians talking about that competence because it's quite an intangible skill and it sounds far less powerful than the pretense to be running the whole show. Now, to understand more about how politicians overclaim, or perhaps just take credit for the wrong things, I'm talking today with leading US legal and constitutional scholar Peter Shane from New York University, famous for his work on the American presidency. Peter, I want to ask you, first of all, what is it about politicians that is so prone to taking credit for things that they haven't done themselves but are in fact bureaucratic achievements?
This is a great question, Stephen. And I guess I want to start by saying it is something of a recent phenomenon, at least in the United States. I don't know how this goes in the UK, but before I entered the academy decades ago, I had a brief stint as within the Federal Justice Department in the U.S. government and in the Office of Management and Budget. And the conventional wisdom, and we're talking about the Reagan administration, and then even after I left government, the first Bush administration, the Bush the father administration, the conventional wisdom was that there was some value to presidents of keeping an arm's length relationship to the bureaucracy. The best of all possible worlds would be if the president could, through the appointments process and through nudging and cajoling behind the scenes, get the bureaucracy to be responsive to the president's values and agenda, but not, as we used to say, have their fingerprints on it. Because the thought would be, let's say the George H.W. Bush administration was going to roll back some environmental regulation. At the same time, Bush wanted to be known as the environmental president. So somebody from the Sierra Club comes to visit him, and he can listen very attentively, very sympathetically, and say, but that's not me. That's the agency. And things really started to change with the Clinton administration. And this is much celebrated by now Supreme Court Justice, then on the President's Domestic Policy Council, Elena Kagan, who said that one of Clinton's innovations was rhetorically being much more aggressive in taking ownership of these bureaucratic initiatives, so that it was always, we're going to regulate tobacco. We're going to regulate this. We've done that. And you could see this carry forward into the George W. Bush administration. So at the very beginning of the George W. Bush administration, there was anxiety about federal funding for stem cell research, fetal stem cell research. And he rather famously repaired to his ranch in Texas and announced at a press conference what he was going to do with regard to the federal funding of fetal stem cell research. But of course, the president has no statutory responsibility or constitutional responsibility for federal fetal stem cell research. This is a function delegated to the Department of Health and Human Services. And so it would have to be something implemented by the National Institutes of Health within the Department of Health and Human Services. This was not going to be formally his decision. His understanding, of course, was that those subordinate to him in the hierarchy would respond to his expression of what would be done. But technically, he didn't order them to do it, and technically, he didn't have the authority to. But he wanted to make it clear that this was his policy. And you can see this, again, going forth into the Obama administration, very aggressively under the Trump administration, who Trump wanted to claim that he was doing everything, and that very much his highly personalistic style. But I think it's very confusing to the public.
I suppose there's a tension here and a potential trade-off here between making government impersonal, which it should be in terms of the law, but making it relatable, which it needs to be in terms of democratic politics. How do you get that balance between impersonality and relatability?
If a balance is to be struck, it's struck, within parameters set by behavioral norms. And there's actually a wonderful article by a Harvard law professor named Daphne Reenan called The President's Two Bodies, where she talks about, and this, I guess, is taken from the idea of the monarch's two bodies, where he is both the person occupying the office and the office. So at the same time, we're talking about the person who happens to be president and the presidency. Again, I would just say, these norms have shifted. Trump, was going to blast through all of them because he wanted everything to be him, personalistic. I think Biden has tried to restore some sense of balance. At some point, I guess every president and every cabinet member is making some politically, one hopes, astute decision about where on that spectrum to stand.
Let's talk a little bit more about Trump, because it's so much fun for those of us who don't live in America to talk about Trump. And he famously argued, I alone can fix these things. It's down to me. I'm the guy who knows how to do this, from building walls to putting the economy right. What's the appeal here, Peter? I mean, at a rhetorical level, I know you're a lawyer, but what is it that makes that kind of claim so seductive, do you think?
It's, again, an interesting question. And I wonder if the answer would be the same regardless of a particular political or cultural context. In the context of the United States, if you look at the core of his support, what is typically called his base, that support comes, strangely enough, given his personal history, significantly from very conservative Christian evangelicals. And there is, I think, a certain, and I'm speaking as an outsider to that movement, so, I'm speculating, but there is the appeal of a personal savior figure. And consciously or not, Trump is still trading on that.
I wonder whether Donald Trump has read the end of that story. Let's, I wonder whether there is something about this that is particularly American. It might be a much more general phenomenon, and that is the notion of individualism and the idea of the guy who gets things done, the entrepreneur, the fixer. And I wonder whether there is something particularly about American democracy, but perhaps about any individualist culture, in which there is a desire to ascribe great acts, as well as horrendous acts, to the active central protagonist.
This would make for a fascinating comparative study. I wonder whether, because I'm assuming that with regard to the individualism spectrum, Brazil, Hungary, Turkey, Israel, the United States are probably not all at exactly the same point. And yet you see a certain pattern among these would-be charismatic, highly personalistic, authoritarian leaders of making the kinds of appeals and claims that you're talking about. A joke was told in my distant youth during the Nixon administration that anyone can grow up to be president, and Richard Nixon has proved it. I mean, right now, Nixon looks like a model of constitutional restraint compared to Trump as his successor, a fellow student of Roy Cohn. I do think insofar as the appeal is not just I can do it, but I can do it because I'm a businessman. And I want to say businessman, not in the generic sense, but in the gendered sense, that is appealing to a certain strain that resonates at least with a certain segment of the American public. And one thinks in terms of what's shaping it, not only America's individualistic values, but also the contemporary media environment. In Trump's big self-advertisement that he's this successful business person, somebody pointed out, if he had just taken the money that his father left him and put it in an index fund, he would have had probably more money, by the time he ran for president than after all of this great deal making. In the 1980s, banks in New York refused to stop being willing to deal with him because he was regarded as so untrustworthy, which is why he famously sort of went off to Germany and Russia for financial help. This is a guy who managed to go bankrupt owning a casino. That by itself seems like an art form. And a lot of his appearance as the successful business guy was just manufactured through a television show called The Apprentice, where he got to supposedly, hire and fire people. It's just all smoke and mirrors.
I'm almost scared to ask you this final question, but I'm going to ask it. Is Trump, for example, the exception or the new normal? Is the kind of personalization which starts with perhaps a few lapses in modesty from a president and becomes in the end a sort of standard rhetorical form of bragging. Is that the future?
I don't think we can say with confidence that there's no risk of that. But one also has to say, he's not the first to try this. I mean, Ross Perot had the same appeal. He was the business guy who was going to straighten out government. He was famously going to look under the hood and make the necessary repairs. In every campaign, there have been some business people, typically on the Republican side, who will make this push. In 2016, I guess, Herman Cain was the head of Little Caesars Pizza or something. He was going to be the business guy who did this. He famously went nowhere. Now the person trying to adopt this mantle is also on the Republican side, a younger person with no prior political experience named Vivek Ramaswamy. And I find this strange because I confess, I don't just find Trump politically unappealing, I find him personally unappealing. And yet many people obviously differ with me on that judgment. But there's something that people resonate to with him that doesn't seem to be working, even with the people who are the Trump imitators. The person who's going to out-Trump Trump was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and his campaign has been a disaster. I mean, he can do an instructional video on how not to run a campaign. On the other hand, Joe Biden, who is trying very much to restore the regular set of norms about how one behaves with regard to other institutions, how one speaks to the press, and so forth, he's getting very little credit for it. So if there's no payoff for playing by the rules, then there will always be a temptation to play the Trump game. That won't go away.
What, I wonder, would politicians sound like if they stopped taking credit for what they can't do and became better at what they can do, which is telling plausible stories, stimulating our imaginations, summarising, simplifying, making compelling, talking about social values and the best ways to realise them in everyday practice. This would involve, I suggest, a rather more democratic tone than we're used to hearing. One that talks less about what I am going to do and more about what we can do together, rather than the bombastic tones of a minister saying that he is going to build the future. It's about how we can build the future. Here's British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Labour Prime Minister from 1945 to 1951. He succeeded Winston Churchill, the politician who epitomised the grand claim, the aura of magical leadership. Attlee's rhetoric lacked such qualities. He would certainly not be the man to stir up a crowd. But there was something quietly democratic in his modest appeal to cooperation, something that contemporary politicians might just learn from.
I am talking to you today because I want to ask you all to help in making this country of ours more prosperous. We've suffered serious destruction of houses and factories, which we've got to rebuild and rebuild quickly. That's the first problem. We've got the enormous job of transforming industry from war purposes to peacetime needs. But just as it took time and careful planning to mobilize for war, so it does for peace. And that's the second problem. The third is this. We have to buy abroad. The mines work perhaps as we'd never worked before. Let us all join together now in one more great effort, this time for victory over scarcity.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why would you answer that
because
question?
the question is the question is
Justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I'm speaking. If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
Well, we're not afraid of weird people. We're a little bit creeped out, but we're not afraid.
We did it. We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Hello, I'm back again. It's Stephen Coleman. And I want to remind you that if you enjoyed this episode, listen to others and perhaps tell other people to listen as well.